Having constructed his theory of absolute sovereignty, Hobbes faces an obvious objection. Doesn't absolute power inevitably produce tyranny? Doesn't a limited authority tempt rulers toward cruelty, oppression, and self-aggrandizement? Haven't we simply replaced the violence of the state of nature with the violence of despotism? Hobbes doesn't deny these dangers. He acknowledges that sovereigns can be foolish, cruel, or self-interested. But he argues that even bad government is preferable to the state of nature, and that any attempt to limit sovereignty recreates the conditions for civil war. Consider the alternatives to absolute sovereignty. Perhaps we could divide power among multiple institutions, each checking the others. But Hobbes would respond, when these institutions conflict, and they inevitably will, who decides? If no institution has final authority, you've recreated the state of nature at the governmental level. If one does have final say, then it alone is truly sovereign, and the division is illusory. Perhaps we could enumerate rights that the sovereign cannot violate, but who judges whether the sovereign has violated them? If subjects judge individually, you have as many final judges as subjects, the definition of the state of nature. If some institution judges, that institution is the real sovereign. Perhaps we could allow resistance when the sovereign becomes tyrannical, but who determines when that threshold is crossed? If subjects decide individually, any subject can declare the sovereign tyrannical whenever they dislike a policy. You've effectively abolished sovereignty and returned to the state of nature. Hobbes's logic seems airtight. Any effective limit on sovereignty requires a higher authority to enforce that limit. But if a higher authority exists, the supposed sovereign isn't actually sovereign. Real sovereignty must be absolute, or it isn't sovereignty at all. Yet Hobbes does recognize some constraints, though they're prudential rather than legal. First, the sovereigns should recognize that their own interest aligns with subjects' welfare. A sovereign who impoverishes or terrorizes subjects weakens the commonwealth and thereby weakens their own position. Enlightened self-interest should moderate tyrannical impulses. Second, the sovereign can't sin against God even while committed no injustice against subjects. Religious sovereigns might be constrained by fear of divine judgment, though this operates through conscience rather than legal obligation.
Third, subjects retain the inalienable right to resist when the sovereign directly threatens their lives, because self-preservation is the foundation of the entire system. You cannot authorize your own death, so a sovereign command to kill yourself generates no obligation. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the sovereign's authority lasts only as long as they can effectively provide protection. A sovereign who cannot maintain order, who is conquered, or who flees loses authority automatically. Obligation is conditional on effectiveness. These constraints are real but limited. They don't create legally enforceable limits on sovereignty. They operate through prudence, conscience, or circumstances rather than institutional checks. Hobbes has solved the problem of order by creating absolute sovereignty, but he hasn't solved the problem of tyranny except by arguing it's preferable to anarchy. This is where critics throughout history have attacked Hobbes most vigorously. John Locke would argue that limited government with rights protections is both possible and necessary. Montesquieu would advocate separation of powers. American founders would design constitutional systems with checks and balances. All are responding to Hobbes by attempting to create effective government without absolute power. Whether these attempts succeed remains contested. Hobbes might respond that in genuine emergencies, war, rebellion, pandemic, economic collapse, governments consistently claim extraordinary powers approaching absolutism. Perhaps his theory describes what effective sovereignty actually requires, even if liberal constitutionalism obscures this reality during normal times.